guys, welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything about mental health and psychology. Firstly, I would just like to say we made it. KSA 13, it's finally over. Or well, almost over. And yeah, so this KSA is about having an inquiring mind and your commitment to the scientist practitioner approach. So let's get straight into what they're asking for, what we need for this KSA. So, like the last few KSAs, this requires a self-statement and a referee writing a statement for you. So that is different to a countersigned self-statement. You need to ask your reference to be able to attest to you having these qualities, that evidence that you have an inquiring mind and that you're committed to the scientist practitioner approach. Let's get into what you can write in your self-statement. And some of these things are maybe suggestions you can give to your referee, asking them to reflect on these areas if you have these qualities. And again, within this self-statement, these are just ideas from what I've written in mine, just to give you some ideas and maybe facilitate some of your reflections on your experiences. Again, you don't have to write these things. Just reflect on your experiences and use these as ideas to be able to do that. Because again, your experiences are going to be different to mine. So if you think of something that I haven't said, or you think something I've said hasn't applied to you, you can just leave it out. Because you don't have to say all the same things that I've said in mine. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get straight into what I spoke about. So firstly, I started with defining the scientist practitioner approach and highlighting its importance. I then went into exploring during my undergraduate how my appreciation for the interaction between theory and practice grew and developed. But then I also spoke about the limitation of this, that it was secondary knowledge, it was textbook knowledge. Does that make sense? So before this, I had only volunteered in mental health charities, so I didn't really have an understanding of what evidence-based practice looks like within a clinical setting. But obviously, if you have this experience, highlight you had this experience and how being on the course and having this experience both developed from each other. I also spoke specifically about the modules within my course that specifically related to clinical practice and research. I then compared the scientist practitioner approach to the participatory approach to psychology and to social interventions. And why I did this was because I had experience having worked in conflict resolution charities and charities that use more a participatory approach compared to, that is such a difficult word to say, compared to the scientist practitioner approach that's used within clinical practice. I saw how there was value in both and how practice uses both. So it encourages clients and stakeholders to actually participate in evaluating the research, evaluating the practice, and how practice tries to merge all of these things together. So then I spoke about my research experience during my undergraduate. And here I don't think it is really relevant if your dissertation isn't related to mental health, isn't related to clinical psychology, or that kind of field within this area, because whatever dissertation you've done, you've contributed to a research base. Does that make sense? So I did my dissertation on catfishing and why people choose to catfish. It was inspired by the MTV show. So yeah, that was my favourite show at the time. So that's what I did my dissertation on. Because here what they want to know is that you can look at a research base, acknowledge a gap and help to address that gap. So that's what I used my dissertation to highlight. So I highlighted that there was a gap within social psychology where catfishing hadn't been explored, but I explored a similar phenomenon that had been researched before. And what I had found is that catfishing is actually an extension of this. It just applies to the online world and completely not using your own picture basically, but still using your own personality, and in some cases fabricating your personality. But enough with my dissertation. But that's what I showed, is that there's a research that I've done that filled a gap that contributed to research. Does that make sense? So I don't think it matters what your dissertation is on. Even if you've done an undergraduate in a completely unrelated field, if you've done a dissertation or research experience within one of the core professions, because I know now, since I've been making these videos, the BABCP have edited their criteria on who has to complete a KSA and who doesn't. But if you fall into one of those categories, even if your undergraduate degree is not psychology related, not mental health related, your dissertation can still be this research experience. So you don't need psychological research experience. I then went into research experience that I had in clinical practice through quality improvement or QI projects that I've participated in. Then I explored how that research was a little bit different in that we did service evaluations and acknowledged gaps within our services, and then went about doing research within the service. I also spoke about seeking feedback and involving carers, involving participants, involving by participants I mean like stakeholders or people participating in the service, and patients, service users. I acknowledged how within practice that is all acknowledged, and the service is really adapted to the community rather than a generic research base. That brings me on to my next point, where I spoke about the limitations of research and how the research base is limited. So you can reflect on the area that you've got experience in and all the areas you've worked in, and how the research within that area has been limited or there's some kind of limitation. So they will most commonly, just to give you ideas, the research limitations could be age, it could be cultural considerations, the evidence base isn't based in the UK or wherever you've done your experience. It hasn't been adapted for certain groups or considerations of certain areas or certain catastrophes that might have been. So for example, if you're working in a trauma service, there might have been a trauma that hadn't been researched before. And especially if you've been working during the pandemic, working within a service, all services have been affected by the pandemic. So you can use that as your experience of how you adjusted, how you overcame the challenges of remote working, how you overcame the research base, what research knowledge did you need, or how your service had to adapt. Because I think many services had to adapt during that period. So you can almost draw on that experience, whether it's also been other global things that have happened, or other adaptation that your service might have needed to make to respond to some kind of crisis. Does that make sense? So really think about the way your service has developed while you've been there, adaptations that they might have needed to make, new groups that they might have needed to develop. And that can apply to both clinical direct mental health experience, but if you've got experience unrelated, just draw on that because it's transferable skills. And then just say how this is transferable to mental health. Does that make sense? So if you research clinical practice, QI projects, things like that, and just say, okay, I've got experience within, let's say, the corporate business world, and how that actually translates and is transferable. Does that make sense? So you're still making the link, but you're just acknowledging that you don't have that experience. I wouldn't directly say it as I don't have this experience, but just say my knowledge is secondary, but I have this experience that I can draw upon both and see how they link. Does that make sense? I also then went into clinical judgment and the importance of practice-based evidence. And practice-based evidence is the evidence is from practicing and your experience. Because especially in some cases, you will need to adapt the knowledge based on practice, because that specific, let's say for example, you're using, let's say, a specific CBT model, right? That hasn't been adapted to the exact client group that you're working with. Let's say it's the traveller community. So if you're working with the traveller community, if you look at the original sample base of CBT, they didn't include that, right? or if you're working with ethnically diverse people in an ethnically diverse community, then CBT was not adapted for that. If you're working with young people, there's principles to be able to adapt CBT to young people, but the original research base for CBT didn't focus on young people. Does that make sense? It was later research, and areas within these research areas are growing, especially with ethnically diverse communities. Recently it's growing over, especially the last year and a half, 2 years, it has been growing, and the knowledge gap is more acknowledged now than it was. But you can talk about how your service has developed to meet your unique community needs. Does that make sense? Then I also broke this up, because my essay was quite long in this area, with the qualities that this shows. So being flexible, being curious, being committed to research-based evidence. I then went also into the ethics of research and the importance of keeping up to date. I also spoke about specific modules within my undergraduate that highlighted the history of mental health research and the history of clinical research, because it hasn't been always the most ethical way. For example, I focused on stress research because a major module that I did was psychophysiology, which really focused on stress research. And stress research was very unethical when it first started. And I spoke about how practices have developed where they were very painful to measure cortisol levels, and now actually it's developed to the point where they just take saliva samples that aren't as, I don't know why I'm getting so tongue twisted in this video, but we're just gonna like roll with it. So that's what I spoke about, the ethics of research and the importance of always keeping up to date, especially keeping up to date with research in mental health in general. So not just focusing on psychological research, really focusing on the biopsychosocial model, and emphasizing the need to be up to date with medical models and medications and social models and their interventions and their research, and then psychological as well, because they all link in together, especially within practice. I also spoke about audits and service evaluations, and specifically the ones that I participated in. I also spoke about its importance, so really drawing in everything together. Then I also went into why research is important, just to end, NICE guidelines and the importance of keeping up to date even with NICE guidelines, especially with being aware of the biopsychosocial models. So it's really appreciating the different areas within psychology and within mental health in general. So really, I think it's really helpful to see psychology and mental health as two separate things, because psychology has different areas. So you have occupational psychology, you have occupational theory, so OT kind of work, you have psychotherapy, you have CBT, you have clinical psychology. You have so many areas and so many depths to different areas that you really need to be aware to be able to work within a team, to work within the wider systems, and even like social work and social work theory. You really need to be aware to be able to work within systems, be aware of how the different systems work. Does that make sense? And the smooth running of services is dependent on you knowing the different parts and the different functions of each service and each individual within your team. Does that make sense? I then went on to my 2 examples. So the 2 illustrative examples, I really provided them in detail. One was the importance of knowing the biopsychosocial model and the different areas within mental health. So I spoke about the biological, the social and the psychological, and how I grew my awareness of the treatments within this area, especially with the medical model, because often that's the one that's most criticized. But medication and the medical model can't be excluded completely, because you just have to acknowledge the biological side of things, especially with some disorders, and the importance of knowing about medication, the side effects of medication, especially if you've been something like a healthcare assistant or an activities coordinator or even an assistant psychologist, a support worker in a supported living setting, a nurse, or anything else that you've somehow worked within a biopsychosocial model if you worked within mental health. So really, you're going to have come across people who need a combination of medication, need a combination of therapies. So really focusing on your experience having used the different types of models, your exposure to the different types of models. For example, I spoke about the medical model and medication because the reference that I used for this was in, so let me start again. So the reference that I used for this section of the KSA was from an inpatient unit, and my reference saw me working with psychosis mainly on an acute site assessment unit. So I added that in just to link it with my reference. Does that make sense? I feel like that was very waffly, but basically, biopsychosocial model, I emphasised the medical model and medication and how that links to the occupational theory that I was working within. So does that make sense? My second one was my limitation of mental health knowledge straight after graduating and how that influenced my practice. And then I spoke about the limitations of the clinical psychology module that I had. And I think at the undergraduate level, clinical psychology will be to almost expose you and help you to learn. It will categorize different disorders separately. But what you will learn in practice, that actually mental health is a lot more complicated than clinical psychology modules lead you to believe. So within clinical psychology modules, they present everything individually. So, okay, someone has an eating disorder and it presents a very simplistic view of eating disorders. But then I spoke about how actually when I've gone into clinical practice, that has actually been a lot more complicated than it was in my clinical psychology module, where I had to synthesize my knowledge of different modules and bring them together. So within my clinical psychology, we learn about different disorders, but we learn about them all as if they were individual things. So when I actually went into clinical practice, I had to synthesize that knowledge and draw from different lectures and different areas of research. And then I also spoke about my limitations in my knowledge and my motivation and commitment to actually gaining knowledge within evidence-based practice, looking within the research and going to find training programs that had been research-based. So that's it for the video, guys. Hopefully it was useful and it's helped you complete the KSA. The next KSA is almost like a CV, so I don't know whether it would be useful for me to do a video about that. But if you would like me to do a video on KSA 14, which is just you highlighting your training and clinical experiences, then just let me know down in the comments and I'll make a video on that. If you would also like me to make a summary video, if you think it's necessary, then I can do that too. But let me know, otherwise I'll just end my KSA videos here and just move on to making videos about other things. So that's it for the video, guys. Hopefully you found the content of this video useful and it helps you in completing your KSA. And this is going to be my final video, unless you guys want another one on KSA 14, which is just almost like your CV, your training experience, your clinical experience, and just listing those. If you would want a video on those, I can do a video on that. And also, if you want me to do a summary video, just summarising the whole KSA and my top tips, then just let me know if you want me to do that. If not, I'll just end my KSA videos here. So yeah, if you found the video useful, like the video. And if you feel like someone else is struggling with their KSA, be kind and share this series of videos with them. And subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, I shall see you guys in the next video.